I have an interesting clip to play for you from Eric Weinstein's podcast, The Portal, which I actually listened to. It's quite an interesting podcast where my name came up in a discussion with Sam Harris. Now, I want to be really clear, especially because Eric and Sam might see this YouTube clip. The YouTube clip title is sort of a joke. My YouTube titles are often sort of jokes. We play around satirically with the ways that it's become sort of en vogue to title YouTube clips. This person was destroyed, that person was attacked, whatever. It's just a joke. So please, the YouTube titles are meant to be interesting, but the important thing is the discussion. It was reported to me over the weekend that Eric Weinstein attacked me and that Sam Harris defended me on Eric's podcast. Now, this was actually an interesting discussion about tactics versus substance. I think I'm being accurate when I say that Eric Weinstein and Sam Harris agree with much of the substance of the left's positions, but seriously question many of its tactics. And I've spoken with Sam Harris about this when he was on the program. So a few names came up during this discussion. Sam Seder's name came up and others. I don't remember who else. And when my name comes up, Sam Harris says, David Pakman, I have seen act in good faith. And Eric Weinstein says, well, not always. Let's take a listen to a couple of minutes from Eric's show.
Well, that's ridicule, but you're ridiculing something that you strawmanned and didn't understand. Right. Because the person actually was making sense. And so what I see is that the left, and in particular the Sam Seder crowd, has a...
Doing that with abandon.
Well, it's willing to do two separate things. Sam is quite willing, like there's this whole thing about, will you talk to Sam Seder? Will you debate Sam Seder? And my feeling is I would debate part of Sam Seder, the part that just is focused on the ideas, but the part that is kind of like nasty and ridiculing and doing the Alinsky thing, I don't know what to do with it. I'm not interested. I've spoken to Sam Seder on the phone. It's perfectly reasonable, made sense to me. We disagreed on positions, but...
Well, the line that gets crossed for me always with these guys, and again, it's disproportionately on the left, is the line of conscious dishonesty. I mean, it's your brother's aphorism, bad faith changes everything.
Bad faith changes everything.
And I mean, these guys are in bad faith. They know they're lying about, in my case, my views, my actual beliefs. And
not all of them.
There's just too much information.
Well, David Pakman...
No, David Pakman's fine. I just did his podcast.
Yeah, I know. But David Pakman said some pretty non-charitable things in some parts that seemed kind of ridiculing. And
of me?
I think you, me, other people.
Well, I've never seen him misrepresenting my views. And I think that, I don't know him. I just did his podcast once, but he seems like somebody who, if I said, listen, you got me wrong here, that would matter, and he would make an effort to get me
and that's
get
the
me
thing,
right.
which is the problem that we have increasingly is that the tactics that are being used in what are called progressive circles have been confused with the content. So that is the objection to the vehicle, which might be Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals,
Which
is conflated
is
with
a
the
totally
payload.
unethical program for smearing people dishonestly.
Well,
being non-charitable, I actually don't think is objectively a problem. I start from a position of charity, and I think we all should when we analyze or critique something. But if we find a reason why someone maybe doesn't deserve our fullest charity, we can retract that charity in good faith. That can still be a good faith action. We don't have to endlessly steelman every false notion that we hear come out of anybody's mouth once we have a better systemic or holistic assessment of their character and whether they act in good faith or bad faith. But that's not really the issue here. Now, Sam Harris asks whether I said things ridiculing him. And of course, the answer is no. What Eric Weinstein is referring to is a clip where I talked generally about the intellectual dark web. And I said, it is not as intellectual as they may want you to think. And I got dozens of emails from people saying, David, are you saying Sam Harris isn't an intellectual? Each time I would answer calmly and clearly, I'm not saying that Sam Harris isn't an intellectual. What I am saying is that there is less intellectualism in the intellectual dark web than they as a loosely organized group might want you to think. And that doesn't just refer to the stars of the IDW, but it also refers to a lot of the followers as well. Now, here's an example, just to be thorough, of when someone would ask me, very concerned, David, were you talking about Sam Harris not being an intellectual? Here's just one example of that coming up and me responding.
Hey, David. I just listened to your take on the pseudo-intellectualism, and I agree with most of those folks that were named in that article, but Sam Harris, really? I don't understand how he's a pseudo-intellectual. Is it because he offends numerous people and he claims that the ideas of Christianity and Islam are completely foolish and stupid? That's the only thing I can think of. Other than that, I'm lost. Help me out, David. I'll talk to you later.
So listen, I mentioned Sam Harris once in yesterday's story, merely in that he was mentioned in a New York Times article called The Intellectual Dark Web by Barry Weiss. I mentioned Sam Harris's name and a number of other names only insofar as I was telling you about the article that sort of got me thinking about the story I did yesterday. I never said yesterday that Sam Harris is not an intellectual. I've read a lot of Sam Harris's work. I have some political disagreements with Sam Harris. I think that his book, The Moral Landscape, is endlessly fascinating. I've never really taken a position on whether Sam Harris is or isn't an intellectual. I believe that he is, and that's okay to say that and still say that I disagree with some of the stuff that he said. My commentary yesterday was not about saying Sam Harris is not an intellectual, and if that's mostly what you focused on, you really missed the point of my entire commentary, okay? So no, I never said Sam Harris isn't an intellectual. I mentioned his name yesterday in passing as one of many 5, 6, 7 different people that were mentioned by Barry Weiss. I think Steven Pinker was mentioned. I'm not saying Steven Pinker is not an intellectual. The commentary was about the environment in which pseudo-intellectualism and faux intellectualism is sort of welcomed and embraced by people, rather than about saying who is or isn't on the list of intellectuals. Now, it is true that, for example, Dave Rubin is not an intellectual. You can agree or disagree with the sort of libertarian small government talking points that Dave Rubin has adopted over the last couple of years. But Dave Rubin is not an intellectual, and I think that that is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It's not an attack on anybody. It's just, I don't even think Dave Rubin would say, although I don't know, that he is an intellectual. What Eric is referring to, and I've spoken to Eric personally about this, is that my comments at the time were probably general enough that somebody who doesn't know me, and Eric didn't know me at the time, and I didn't know Eric at the time, someone could interpret what I was saying to mean that there are no intellectuals in the intellectual dark web. That is, of course, now very clearly not what I meant. But much of the story was actually about the pseudo-intellectualism in the audiences of the IDW movement, to the extent that those exist, not about the members themselves. This is a totally different conversation. Now, at the same time, this is a critique I've made about people who read Bill O'Reilly's pop history books and read nothing else and think they are now informed historians because they read Bill O'Reilly's take on Abraham Lincoln or whatever. It is a different story, and it is a story about the ways in which the messages from, doesn't matter who it is, and I'm not equating Sam Harris to Bill O'Reilly, believe me. It is a story about the followers, which is a very interesting one, actually, that I think deserves a lot of examination. So the fair critique of me, based on what Eric is saying, is David Pakman wasn't clear or precise enough when I made my initial commentary about the intellectual dark web. These commentaries, by the way, at this point, are roughly 2 years old. I looked for my IDW critiques that Eric was referring to, and I found a clip from May of 2018, which maybe is the one. Maybe they're even older. I don't know. So I know what Eric is referring to. Eric and I have had nice conversations. We've been talking about maybe getting him on the David Pakman show, me being on his show if I'm in LA at some point. I have proposed some dates to Eric for being on with me. I have not heard back, but it's still something I'm interested in. I think most of my audience knows that even if you disagree with me on my conclusions, I am a good faith actor who simply calls things like I see them, and I am not deliberately dishonest. So I'm fine with this discussion that took place, and I think everybody was reasonably respectful, although I simply disagree with the characterization of what Eric said about my previous comments.